Okay, so we're back. If you want to watch the rest of that, it's actually on the YouTube channel, so you can have a look. But the last bit of that, Denzel was starting to talk about aloes and then about their history of migration from Africa to other parts of the world, but particularly to the West Indies. So yeah, we have some colleagues here. And David, good to see you. Thanks for coming through. Yeah, so over to Anthony and Denzel then. Anthony?
Yep. Good.
Okay,
Good afternoon, everybody. It is 9 o'clock out here in the Caribbean. And so we realize that you are on the other end of the clock. You're ready to go home. So
yeah.
Thank you very much for hanging around, and thank you very much for your invitation. I'm going to close my camera off now and share screen. So,
yeah.
Okay, folks. What we've been invited to talk about has been mentioned before: the migration of some plants around the Atlantic during slavery. My collaborator in this is Denzel Phillip, who you saw just now. Denzel is living in Barbados these days, and we always find time to get together, brainstorm, and do a little bit of work together. Before launching into the plants that came from Africa to the Caribbean with the enslaved people, I think it's worth mentioning, we really wanted to mention that a number of plants did go in the other direction. The Caribbean's indigenous people and their indigenous knowledge has made an enormous contribution to the foods of the world. And over here in the Caribbean, we're beginning to look at the indigenous food crops again. Some people consider them forgotten foods, but we're working with others, I can tell you about that later, to encourage the cultivation of some of these crops along with the African crops in school gardens and to increase their use in school meals. But the question that we are going to address today is the movement of plants from Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas with slavery. And it's of increasing interest to the academic community. In about 2010, the Society for Economic Botany held a meeting in South Carolina, led by Professor John Rashford, who you see on the left, and a special edition of the Journal of Economic Botany covers quite a lot of the material that we're going to present here. What we wanted to do is to highlight it because there's rapidly growing interest in the United States. Here you see books and videos and a Netflix series all about African-American cooking and the contribution that it's made to American cuisine, right? How they say that the enslaved people enslaved the American palate. And now we're in a situation where the things that used to be slave foods have become superfoods. So an alternative title for our talk could have been From Slave Food to Superfood. Okay, here's a list of the plants, some of the most important plants that came across the Atlantic. We've garnered these from among very many plants identified by researchers and gathered together by Judith Carney. And you'll see the famous aloe #2 there and many others. And we'll just have a look at a couple of them and highlight the way they've become important in the Caribbean and the outlook for products of pharmaceutical, cosmeceutical, and culinary interest. So how did the plants come over, right? Here, Sir Hans Sloane, who started the British Museum of Natural History, says that he found planted from Africa peanuts, which had been brought from Africa on slave ships to provision the ships. And that's the general model that we're looking at. There's evidence here and there that a lot of food, a lot of African food, yams, rice, peanuts, were placed on slave ships. The African women were made to cook that food for the journey of 2 months or 3 months across the Atlantic. And when these ships arrived in the Caribbean, they would dump that food. And then those foods started to turn up in the gardens of enslaved people. So famously, Thomas Jefferson, the early president of the United States, saw pigeon peas, black-eyed peas, growing in the gardens of his enslaved people on his plantation. And then he encouraged the growing of that crop as a plantation crop in his fields and started to market it. And that happened over and over. Some plantation owner would notice that Africans were growing rice. This happened very early in Brazil and later in South Carolina. And soon it becomes a plantation crop because the plantation owners see it, note its value, and then it becomes an export crop. Masses and masses of rice were going from Brazil back to Europe, especially to Portugal, even before the British started to colonize the Caribbean. So, you know, this is the general movement of the slave trade. And you will see that the focus is the west coast of Africa, called the Slave Coast, and Southwest Africa. Of course, people were also taken from Eastern and Southern Africa, and you see where they ended up. The pigeon pea is one of those wonderful foods that arrived in the Caribbean from Angola. They're still called Congo peas or Angola peas in the Caribbean. Right, another one that came over is Hibiscus sabdurifer, which has many, many names across the continent. The leaves, of course, are eaten in the continent, but in the Caribbean, the leaves are made into a drink. Since the plant flowers in September, October, November, and fruits at Christmas, it's become a famous Christmas drink. And in the Caribbean, we delight in the story of how Anansi the spider introduced the sorrel or the hibiscus plant into the Caribbean. These are just a few of the products from Hibiscus sabdurifer that are being marketed now, and some of the scientific data that's accumulated over the years. It's rich in saponins and catechol and all sorts, and used traditionally as a laxative in Europe, a laxative called cacade. Okra is another global food which left Africa with slavery, right, and ended up becoming an important part of Caribbean North American food. The word okra comes from Igbo in Nigeria, and gombo from Bantu languages like Kimbundu and Angola in Southwest Africa. On the left, you see okra being served with mfunji in Angola, and on the right, you see the same dish, similar dish being served in my country. It's our country's national dish, and it keeps the Angola name fungi. So, as you know, okra is well tolerated by humans. It has all these properties on the right, the left. In particular, it has a lot of growing interest in its ability to relieve stress. That's a growing interest these days. But okra is only one of the slimy foods that came across the Atlantic. The baobab leaves and many, many other greens are used, as you know, in parts of Africa to help the starch go down, to soften the starch. And this is an area of nutrition that's been overlooked by Western nutritionists and deserves further attention. Some of the cosmetic applications of okra. And then we come to this plant, the famous bitter melon, Momordica charantia. There's been debate about whether it comes from India or Africa, and genetic analysis of the genus and family has placed Momordica charantia in Africa, from which it probably was taken to Asia, and the larger fruit domesticated and spread in India and China. What we're saying here is that it came to the Caribbean from Africa with African names and African uses. It's well known, it's known as Seracea, for example, in the Caribbean, and that comes from Fon and Ewe languages of Ghana and West Africa, Ghana and Togo. So these are some of the other names over here, but we know that in Africa, in West Africa, it has an amazing ceremonial use. Here you see the Ga King, the Gamatse, with Momordica wreath around his neck. And over here you see some Ashanti or Akan guards at Kofi Onan's funeral, wreathed in the protective Momordica charantia. Not unlike the way the Olympics and Air Force captains have the laurel leaves around their hats. This use has received no scientific attention at all. And in a time when we're looking at aromatherapy and the importance of the smell of the forest and green plants, Japanese plants are in the forefront of research here. And I think it may be worth looking at how smelly plants used for their smell, seem to ward off evil for their smell, what role they play in aromatherapy. This other Momordica fetida, is used widely for skincare in Africa. Here's a Ugandan baby having its Ekyogro bath, and my wife's from Uganda. And some of the plants that are coming out of the Caribbean, especially Haiti. Momordica charantia is the diaspora plant. There is no part of the tropical Americas all the way to Florida where this does not play a very important part in the medicinal cabinet of Black people and Hispanic people. Yes, here's some of its nutrition. All right, and I wanted to wind down with African rice. And the story here takes the role of the Africans one step further. We saw earlier how they started to grow rice on the coasts. And then when they escaped from slavery and ran to the forest to become Maroons and set up their own villages, the story goes that some women plaited the rice into their hair. And this activity, these stories are being researched in Suriname, in the Caribbean part of South America, and being followed up with genetic work. The African rice and other rices were taken into the forest, where they're still grown in the villages of Maroon people who resisted the soldiers of the Dutch. All right, so to finish, just want to tell you some of what's been going on in the Caribbean. If you remember nothing else from this talk, please do remember tramil.net, which is a 40-year program of ethnobotany in the Caribbean and is working towards Caribbean herbal pharmacopoeia. Another development, recent development, the University of the West Indies, my alma mater, has formed links with Ghana, and just a few months ago signed an MOU with the University of Cape Coast to focus on this sort of thing, the plants and language and so on, which have crossed the Atlantic. So it's called the Transatlantic Center of Excellence in Translational Research. And one of the pharmacognosy programs that they're starting with is to look at ulcers in diabetes. Okay, so thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Richard. So you have certainly schooled us on hidden history, and I think that's the thing that's amazing about these webinars, that you get. I don't know much about the Caribbean. I remember reading David Picking's chapter in my book, and that was the first I got to know about some of the history there. So this is very important work you're doing. I do hope that you will submit something for the special issue. Yeah, because that would be really good. There's a question, Uli, you can unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that interesting talk, I must say. I agree with David. I saw Calentia pinnata, Bryophyllum pinnata on the list of plants that immigrated to your region. So what is it used there over there?
Yeah, good question. Bryophyllum pinnata is a Madagascar plant, thought to be of Madagascar origin, but spread across the continent and became a sacred plant in West Africa. And it's come to the Caribbean, where it's known as leaf of life or wonder of the world. Denzel, you can jump in at any time. And it's used in my home, it would have been used for treating the early effects of colds and flus, congestion. The leaf was crushed with salt and swallowed. It's also used, warmed and used to treat boils, right? Sometimes crushed into a poultice or applied as a warmed whole leaf onto boils, and used in Afro-Caribbean religious ceremonies. A leaf of life is often found on the altars of shrines and religious centers which remember our African roots, Afro-Christian religions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, Denzel, anything to add on there?
I don't think I have a lot to add, Anthony. As you can hear, is a mine of information, and I've been very fortunate to work with him in the last few years on this, not just this subject, but the whole issue of Caribbean plants. I hope we will get together to produce an abstract for the journal. Yes, that is understood, that we will submit something for that. But it's an area in which there's need for much more information coming from Africa as well, from both sides.
Mm-hmm.
We need that research being done by a group of African researchers as well as to what came across. I think that's very important. So building those links, as you see, that's starting in an institutional way, but maybe through your platform or whatever, we can get more direct contact between African and Caribbean researchers in this field and hopefully build some businesses out of it. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, that's great. And it's good to see that you're also working on the pharmacopoeia. So I think we have a lot to learn from each other. Thank you very much. Okay, the final presentation is by Yvonne Kunatsa. She's a master's student here at Tshwane University of Technology. Yvonne, over to you. You can put it on slide mode.